Hello, I'm Bailey Becker, and welcome to episode 3 of How Game of Thrones Contradicts Itself. Stannis by Me. Now, Stannis Baratheon is a controversial figure among the fandom and an unpopular figure in the story due to his very dour and humorless personality and absolute commitment to the law and the rules above all else. His struggle in the War of the Five Kings, in which he can't attract any supporters due to his less than magnetic personality, and where he has to basically fight against all factions as he won't compromise with any of them and considers all of them to be either usurpers or trying to steal parts of his kingdom, but Renly being the former, along with Joffrey, and the Starks and Greyjoys being the latter. So this leaves him in the position of having to either compromise his principles by negotiating with the other side, which he won't do. And if he did, by compromising the law, since he is the legal heir, he'd be compromising the very structure on which he bases his claim to be the rightful king. Or he has to do what he did and fight a war with hardly any soldiers or supplies. So we're supposed to believe his lawful nature is ruining him. But he would have to either compromise the law or lose. But I would argue two things. First, I would argue that the actions that caused problems for Stannis were actually violations of his lawful principles, and that it was perfectly within his power to accomplish what he wanted to accomplish while staying true to his principles, and that there are concrete examples of ways he could have done that. To start with, the Battle of Blackwater, one of the most famous moments of the series, which Stannis lost, despite the fact that he had the Lannisters badly outnumbered due to half of Renly Baratheon's army defecting to him. Renly was killed by this freaky shadow demon that was spawned from Melisandre as a result of Stannis sleeping with her. Stannis is a married man, he committed adultery. And the battle that he fought as a result of the forces he gained by committing adultery was a humiliating loss. So he was not at all rewarded for violating the law, for violating his principles. He certainly ended up no better off than he started, possibly worse off. And that's the exact opposite of what we're supposed to believe. There's also the whole burning people alive thing, which is a big part of the reason why a lot of the fans don't like him. And it ultimately led to his downfall, most directly by burning his daughter alive after his supplies were destroyed during the approach to Winterfell. This resulted in half his army deserting and the rest being completely wiped out by Ramsay Bolton, and Stannis himself killed shortly thereafter by Shireen Baratheon, by Brienne of Tarth. Sorry. So, again, this murder of his innocent daughter was punished. He killed an innocent, which is a violation of the law, someone he knew to be innocent, his own daughter, and he was punished for it. It destroyed him. But making moral and legal compromises like that is supposedly exactly what you're supposed to do in this setting, and it worked out horribly for him when he did it. Which leads me to think that, again, that's just because the narrative is against him. He's not favored by the writers and showrunners, more so in the show than in the books. And so they want to screw him over. They want to make him look bad and screw him over in every way they can. And letting such your personal preferences get in the way of characterization and plot and staying true to your themes is exactly counter to what this series is supposed to be about. And also, I would argue, this really only applies in the books, and so I think my point stands on its own without it, but to supplement it, in the books, it was Stannis who actually started the investigation into whether Robert and Cersei's children were in fact Robert's. And he approached he was suspicious, and he approached John Aaron about it, knowing that Robert wouldn't listen to him, but he would listen to John. And he left the capital after John's death. Now he could have at least sent a letter to Ned Stark warning him and sharing some of the intelligence he found, and had he done that, and had Ned Stark been able to catch on quicker, there's a good chance the whole thing could have been avoided. And since Stannis is the legal heir, that would have possibly allowed Stannis to take the throne bloodlessly. It's certainly more likely to have ended well for Stannis than what actually happened. But he didn't do that because he's always resented Ned Stark due to Ned having a much more brotherly relationship with Robert than Stannis, who's, Robert's actual brother. He never liked Ned for that. So he let his own personal grudge against Ned get in the way of doing the lawful thing, which would have been to expose this deception in the most expedient way possible. Again, that's a violation of his commitment to law, and it turned out horribly for him and many, many other people. So again, he was punished for violating his principles, which isn't what we're supposed to believe based on this show. It was logic. Now, as to how once the war began, he could have avoided, he could have possibly won. Well, I can think of several things he could have done differently that were well within his power and well within his principles to do, but for some reason he didn't. For starters, he could have made more use of his right-hand man, Sir Davos Seaworth. Stannis, as we know, has little charisma, and he has a magnetic personality of the kind that repels. But Davos is the exact opposite. He was able to convince the mercenary pirates, Salador San, and the Iron Bank of Braavos to back Stannis, despite Stannis lacking ready capital to pay them. He did that. He was able to do that by basically just convincing them that it was still in their best interest to work with Stannis, and he succeeded. So why exactly didn't Stannis have him do the same thing with Starks? At least. It's entirely plausible he could have. I would argue that on paper, Stannis' interest and the Starks' interests align quite seamlessly. Robb, after all, didn't start out intending to be king or secede. He didn't have an end game at all. His first goal was to rescue his father, but that didn't pan out. He was pushed into it by his bannerin. So it's entirely plus some of those vassals of House Stark, such as Galbert Glover, expressed support for Stannis, and Robb's own mother, Catelyn, who has a strong influence over him, when she was at the parley with Stannis and Renly, she expressed openness to putting aside any claims of kingship and just working with Stannis to defeat the Lannisters. So there's certainly room there for Stannis to make them his friends, and he could have done that with Davos' help. Especially since, in the books, he succeeded at swaying the Northern Lords to his side with Davos' help after the Red Wedding. Why couldn't he have done that beforehand? There's no real reason that I see. For some reason, he didn't bring Davos to the parley with Renly and Catelyn. I don't think there's an explanation given for this in the show at all. Oh, I could be wrong, though. In the books, it was because he'd sent Davos to deliver letters proclaiming Joffrey Baratheon to be a usurper and himself to be the rightful king to the Stormlords. But he said, when assigning that task to Davos, that the recipients would probably burn the letters unopened, which means they wouldn't listen to anything their bearer had to say. So, I mean, that's a job any random messenger could have done. It seems like a huge, pointless waste to send Davos to do that. Why did he do that? I don't know. Again, I can only assume that's because the writers want Stannis to fail. They want things to be hard for him. That's the only reason I can perceive for writing it that way. So after that, so later on in the series, Stannis tries to make Mance Rayder, king of the wildlings, bend the knee to him. Mance doesn't, because the wildlings would never fall to someone who bowed to a foreign ruler, and if Mance did bend the knee to Stannis, that wouldn't help Stannis anyway, since it'd be just one guy who used to be king. Bowing to him wouldn't do Stannis any good anyway. Now, for all his faults, Stannis is supposed to be a stickler for the law, so he should realize that Mance is under no legal obligation to bow to him, since the wildlings have never been part of the Iron Throne's dominions, and thus Stannis has no claim over their loyalty as heir to the Iron Throne. However, he could have simply challenged Mance to a duel for leadership of the wildlings. They do, after all, follow whoever's strongest. Now, it's true Stannis isn't a wildling, but Mance defected to the wildlings from the Night's Watch, and the wildlings would later follow the leadership of Jon, a former Night's Watchman, one who arguably betrayed them at one point. So there's no reason. So it's entirely plausible then that they would follow Stannis if Stannis proved himself to be a strong warrior and worthy of their allegiance, which he is entirely capable of doing. It's entirely possible also that he would lose the fight with Mance, but that's a lot less risky than what he ended up doing. So, again, why didn't he do this, or why didn't he suggest it? No reason that I can see, other than that the writers and showrunners want him to fail. Also, for some reason, he never tried sending an envoy to House Umber, even though the Umbers hate the wildlings more than anybody else, and it was Jon letting the wildlings move south of the Wall that drove Small Jon Umber to ally with the Boltons against Jon. Now, the possibility of recruiting the Umbers is never even discussed, and also Small Jon isn't terribly loyal to House Stark, obviously, and nor evidently is he hung up on northern nationalism, if that's the proper word for it, since he was willing to ally with the Boltons and by extension the capital. And there's a lot to be gained, I would argue, for him by allying with Stannis and helping overthrow the Boltons. He could have, but again, and Davos Seaworth probably could have convinced him of this if he didn't realize it already. But again, this isn't. We don't even hear anything of Small Jon Umber until long after Stannis' death, and this possibility is never raised in the show. Again, why? There's no reason. The only reason is, again, that the only reason for this and everything else I've discussed is the fact that the writers want Stannis to lose. It's not a fact, but based on what I see, the only logical conclusion is that the writers want Stannis to lose. The narrative does not favor Stannis. And to favor anyone like that, it runs exactly counter to the themes of this series. Or to disfavor anyone like that runs exactly counter to the themes of this series. Alright, as always, be sure to like and share and favorite it if you enjoyed it. And always be sure to let me know what I could improve or what I did well in the comments. Thank you. See you next week.